You know, we now live in a country in which the federal government has the power to seize any American through the Army, police forces, FBI, take him into custody, and cart him away to a concentration camp, or a military dungeon, or a prison. Torture him, even kill him, or hold him there for the rest of his life, without a jury trial, without due process of law, simply by naming him a terrorist in the war on terrorism. We live in a country in which the police forces of the federal government can break into people's homes secretly, surreptitiously, peer into what you're doing in your private affairs, monitor your emails, watch what telephone calls you're making, and all without a warrant. And even if a warrant's required, they know that nothing's going to happen to them anyway if they get caught. As we learned in the telecom scandal, the President of the United States gets the chief executive officers of the telecoms to illegally turn over people's telephone records, email records, and Congress just gives them immunity. We live in a country in which the President, on his own initiative, can send the entire nation into war. Imagine that. Without any declaration of war by Congress. Notwithstanding the fact that that's what the Constitution expressly requires. Nothing's going to happen to him for violating that provision of law. Indeed, as we're all learning now, the President wields the authority through the CIA and the military-industrial complex, the standing army, to assassinate any American. And, of course, anyone else around the world. No due process of law, no warrants, no judicial interference, just assassination. It's an extraordinary situation under which we're living. And I think everyone would agree that that's not exactly the kind of government that our ancestors had in mind when they brought this government into existence with the Constitution. And we have to keep that in mind, that we the people called this government into existence. And let me tell you something. The American people were not too excited about it. They were very leery. They'd been operating under the Articles of Confederation, and they feared that this new federal government would become the biggest threat to their lives and their liberty and their property. But those who were calling for this said, look, you don't need to worry, because this is not going to be a government that can do whatever it wants. This is going to be a government of limited, enumerated powers. If the power is not enumerated, it's not delegated, they cannot exercise it. So if there is no power to take people into custody without due process, to torture them, cart them away to a dungeon, keep them there for the rest of their life, no problem. They can't exercise it. And so the people went along with this thing, but only on the condition that immediately after the government was called into existence, the Bill of Rights would be enacted. And it really shouldn't be called a Bill of Rights. It should be called a Bill of Prohibitions. Because really that's what it does. It prohibits the government from interfering with fundamental rights like freedom of speech and freedom of religion, the right to keep and bear arms. But there's 4 special amendments there that stick out, that are not dealing with fundamental rights. Instead, they're dealing with this power of government to seize people and inflict cruel and unusual punishments, keep them in jail for the rest of their lives with no jury trial, no due process of law. And that's 4 amendments that our American ancestors demanded that revolve around this power of government. The 4th Amendment, the 5th Amendment, the 6th Amendment, and the 8th Amendment. Extraordinary amendments that deal with the power of government to take people into custody and do bad things to them. You know, to put things in a more historical context, we can go back to the year 1215 And we get a sense of what the English people were living under, because they were living under the same kind of regime that we're now living under. It was a regime where the king could go out through his soldiers and order the arrest of any English citizen, cart him away to the Tower of London, put him on the rack, and torture him, execute him. And there was nothing people could do. This was just a standard affair. The king was in charge, the people were subservient. They belonged to the king until 1215. And that was when the barons of England held their king, their government, at the point of a sword and extracted from their own government a concession, an admission that that king's powers were no longer omnipotent, that he was restricted from doing this to people anymore. Now notice that the barons were not talking about a free society in terms of doing it less. They weren't calling for a more discriminatory use of this power, the power to seize people and cart them away arbitrarily. They were taking away the power. That's how they measured freedom. The absence of power within the executive. And so the king says, no longer will this British government seize people, cart them away in violation of the law of the land. And that phrase, law of the land, in Magna Carta, gradually weaves its way up through the centuries and becomes what we know as due process of law. That's the phrase in the Fifth Amendment, and that phrase is part of our psyche as Americans. Everybody knows it by the time he's an adult. He knows about this principle of due process of law. It's our heritage. It goes back centuries to Magna Carta. And it came to be known as, at a very minimum, notice and hearing that you will never ever, you in the government, go in there and take somebody away and do bad things to them without notifying them of their charges in advance and giving them an opportunity to be heard. Trial by jury, which is in one of those amendments. That you have a right to confront the witnesses against you. That you have a right to remain silent. You have a right to a lawyer representing you in court, making your case. I mean, these are the things that stand out, that distinguish America from the rest of the world. Some of the things when I was growing up and thinking about becoming a lawyer that just made me proud to be an American. Those 4 amendments, along with the rest. Ironically, these powers are being exercised not only by the U.S. government, but also by totalitarian regimes all over the world. The Egyptian government, that is a military dictatorship, one of the many that the U.S. government ardently supports with cash and armaments, and that has in fact used as a torture partner in its rendition program, enthusiastically, because they believe in this military regime. They believe in these powers. That military dictatorship in Egypt exercises and wields the exact same powers that we're now living under. This is not what our American ancestors had in mind. You see, they believed that the greatest threat to their freedom was one's own government. And that's why all these barbed wire restrictions and barriers within the 4th, 5th, 6th, and 8th Amendments and the rest of the Constitution. So how did it come to this? How did we arrive at this thing? And that's what 9/11 was all about. I mean, they capitalized on 9/11 to effect what is really, I consider, the most monumental legal revolution in our country's history. To acquire these totalitarian powers. Now people say, oh, Jacob, we're having elections. Isn't that democracy? I mean, that we're electing people. And well, okay, we're electing a president with totalitarian powers. You might call that democratic totalitarianism. But it's not freedom. It's not freedom at all. And what they did right after 9/11, they established this military encampment at Guantanamo Bay, which is quite fitting, because on the other side of the island, The communist regime there exercises the exact same powers. And ironically, all these people that have taken an oath to support and defend the Constitution were making this a Constitution-free zone. They said the Constitution that we have sworn to defend doesn't apply here. It was like they were ashamed of it. Like they didn't want to have anything to do with it. They said the Supreme Court, the federal judiciary, doesn't have any involvement in Guantanamo Bay. I sat there and said, wait a minute, these are principles that we're supposed to be proud of. If you're going to establish this zone, why would you want to embrace the principles that exist in our Constitution? That's not what they wanted to do. Because they wanted to set up a system that was just like the military regime in Egypt that they've been supporting for decades, along with other such totalitarian regimes. They believed in that kind of system. And people were saying, oh, well, they're only going to do it to foreigners. No problem, they're only going to do it to foreigners. And if you look at the 4th, 5th, 6th, and 8th Amendments, it doesn't talk about foreigners. It says you're not going to do this to anyone. So it talks in terms of people, not citizens. And sure enough, though, we argued at the Future of Freedom Foundation after 9/11, if they're going to do it to foreigners, they're going to do it to Americans. Because it's the logic that in this war on terrorism, as they called it, a terrorist can come in any kind of citizenship. And they themselves were signaling when they said the whole world's a battlefield. Well, that gave it all. The whole world's a battlefield. That includes the United States. And of course, that was what the case of Jose Padilla was all about. You know, they took this guy who they felt was the most unsympathetic guy they could find so that Americans would cheer what they were doing. They took him out of the federal court jurisdiction. They carted him over to a military dungeon in South Carolina where they tortured him, utilizing the techniques of mental torture that they had acquired from the North Korean communists, who had done it to American POWs, sensory deprivation, isolation. But what was really mattering here, and what we kept telling people, is that they're arguing in the Court of Appeals, the Federal Court of Appeals, the power not just to do it to Padilla, but the power to do it to every single American. And they won. They won. And their argument was that they could take a criminal offense, like terrorism, and automatically convert it into an act of war at their option. Because everybody agrees that terrorism is a federal criminal offense. No one denies it. Okay? I mean, it's in the U.S. Code. You got federal courts prosecuting, where there's criminal prosecutions every day for terrorism. Everybody agrees on that. What they did is they figured out a very clever way to undo centuries and centuries of constitutional protection by calling this an act of war at their option. It's like the drug war. If all of a sudden they said, well, the drug war, we're at war, and we're going to declare that we have the option of saying drug dealers that we label as drug dealers are now enemy combatants. And we can now Guantanamo Bay those people too. That's what they did. It's very clever. And with that one fell swoop, because everybody's so scared after 9/11, everybody went along with it, they revolutionized our legal system. And they said, oh, well, the terrorists are coming, they hate us for our freedom and values. Nonsense. All that was a cover to cover up all the wrongdoing they'd been doing for years in the Middle East. And when we libertarians point to the wrongdoing, they say, oh, you're blaming America. Blaming America. They conflate the federal government with America instead of separating out the two. The federal government's one entity, the country's the other thing. In fact, the Bill of Rights protects the country from the federal government. But they were doing bad things to people. You got the sanctions in Iraq that were killing hundreds of thousands of children. You had Madeleine Albright, the U.S. ambassador to the UN, telling the world through 60 Minutes that the deaths of 500,000 Iraqi children were worth it. You got the stationing of troops near Mecca and Medina, the holiest lands of the Muslim religion. You got the unconditional support to the Israeli government. I mean, on and on, that was stirring this cauldron of anger and hate. Every time you look at what these terrorists are saying, going back to the World Trade Center bombing in '93, where one of the guys in his sentencing hearing points to what the government's been doing in foreign policy. It's all about what the government's been doing. And so that's why we argue at the Future of Freedom Foundation the vital importance of civil liberties. that we've got to defend what our ancestors were doing with those 4 amendments. But more important, we got to take this weed out by its root. That what's causing all this anger and hatred, that then is manifesting itself in terrorist threats, that they then use to take away our freedoms, that we've got to challenge that whole paradigm of empire, the thousands of, the 1,000 bases overseas, the interventions, the invasions, the kidnappings, the renditions, the torture, the sanctions, the embargoes. Dismantle that whole military machinery, national security state machinery. Bring all those people home and discharge them. But they'll convince you that, oh my gosh, you will be unsafe without the government policing the world and intervening everywhere. And that brings us to, what can we do about this? And they will convince you, especially when you're in college. I heard these arguments back then, during the Vietnam War and stuff, that all this stuff's necessary. It's permanent. Get used to it. Forget your ideals. Forget your principles. Forget trying to achieve a free society. I heard it all. It's not permanent. Now, that's exactly what the Egyptian military dictatorship is telling its people. That we come first, the military regime. Get used to it. Build your society on top of that foundation. Nonsense. Nothing's permanent in this thing. And what you've got to ask yourself, what every American's got to ask himself is this a free society? Is it consistent with a free society? And if it's not, then how important is it for you to achieve a free society? And then you've got to decide what you need to do to achieve that free society. And everybody's interest and everybody's talents is different. You've got to decide where you fit into this thing. But if those of us that are in the older generations get together with those of you in the younger generations, and all of us have this commitment to freedom, we can achieve it. It ain't easy. If freedom were easy, everybody in history would have had it. Because everybody wants to be free. Our challenge is, how bad do we want to be free? And are we willing to do what's necessary to achieve it? But a prerequisite to all of this is to maintain our ideals, our integrity, and our principles. If we do that, there's no doubt in my mind that we can dismantle what they've done and restore a free society to our land. Thank you very much.